welcome to Zion's Banner. Trusting everything will end up working. It's been quite a night. I'm seeing people start to appear in the house, and we are live and on. So I am excited. Hey, I want to talk to you a little bit about an experience. You're going to see a link up above in the top chat, and that link is there for a reason. So let me introduce you to Mark. And I'm just going to quickly bop over here for just a second here. Mark Lucas, and he's the guy who I was on his radio program this morning. Isn't that nice? He's smiling. He was an area pastor that started a radio program that deals with the interesting questions of life, meaning, and some of those other things. And so I was invited on his show, and there I am, and I'm excited. It looked really good. And so I included the general link to the station. It's a local radio station called Faith Talk. I don't know how far it reaches into the valley, but they also podcast, which is pretty normative these days, especially for radio. And so I wanted to let you know there'll be more information about that coming. But it was an exciting morning when I got there. And the time went so quickly. Mark is an incredibly good interviewer and talker, and just a great guy that likes to get to the questions of life. And so he allowed me on his program, and I think that went really well. And so I'm hoping that that will allow a few more people to know about our community. And I shared kind of how I came to the place where I am now, and what God used, and how you can kind of sense what God, where you sort of fit into his plan. And so that's what that's all about. I have been very busy today dealing with the fallout from the coronavirus. We have a major missions trip to see my first grandkid, and so and then speak at about 4 or 5 churches. We really need the Lord to hold that in place. So the prayers among you or who watch this, please pray God's hedge of protection around that trip. I've also been dealing with a Muslim outreach conference we're supposed to have in the area, and since some of the folks were coming in from out of town, there have been some issues there, and so I've been kind of fielding this. On my Facebook page, my personal one, I posted some things that C.S. Lewis said related to this, not the coronavirus, but a similar threat in his day. I understand that there are immunity compromised individuals, and I do have my concerns, but I have to say I'm not enjoying the hype. The statistics that I'm getting related to this don't make me think it's quite the bubonic plague yet. And so I'm sort of tired of the hype. I know that there are going to be effects, but people are going crazy here in Phoenix. We have guys that are, literally buying all of the tissue paper or bathroom paper out of the entire store. And then there are folks that literally have walked in and emptied a shelf of hand sanitizer. This type of fear is not good. The enemy produces fear. This is not good stuff. And so some of my relatives have some really strange theories about this, but I'm really praying that God will allow people to just kind of exhale. So I'm glad everything isn't canceled. One church canceled, but 4 are holding steady. We really need this to kind of happen for us, and this country needs to relax. It's not good, but it isn't the bubonic plague. This thing is not 100% fatal all the time, and we have people working on it. So my prayer is that people will begin to exhale, because it's the hysteria out here is just getting crazy. Let's move on to things pertaining to faith instead of things pertaining to fear. So we're going to be in Matthew. We're going to see who has control over the entire world, and why we as believers don't need to freak out. And we're also going to see what it looks like, or what a sign might be of God's blessing. Um, as I was preparing for this week, I was asking questions about guys like Hudson Taylor, who ministered throughout their entire life and did not see a ton of converts, money, and did not do infomercials. And I'm not against getting the word out about ministry, but the point was he didn't have all this outward success. What can I learn from Jesus about ministry? And so that's where things are. Um, Someone just came into the room. I am getting new information about the Muslim conference in town. Everything is going to be going on pretty much, but there are a few changes. Saturday's still set, and next Friday night's still set. So that's for the person who is actually going, just to know. But there have been a few glitches with the VBS. We can't have the kids. We just can't have Muslim kids come and something go screwy. So there have been a few changes there. I have an email address, and I will update. That's for the locals. And I was talking about the need to preserve hand sanitizer and trust Jesus, because the fear is just not good for people. So we are going to find out about ministry. And as I said, I was asking questions. What could I learn about ministry from Jesus's Galilean ministry? What could I learn about a sign of God's blessing from Jesus's Galilean ministry? How did guys like Hudson Taylor continue to go when they didn't necessarily see all the outward signs and glitz occur in their ministries, and yet they were faithful for years and years? And so as I was reading this, I was seeing what I could learn. And so we're going to look at what is a sign of God's blessing. Jesus's ministry grows, and his Galilean ministry is summarized here. And so that's where we're at. We're in 9. Jesus has been questioned about fasting. We are finishing up the miracles there. Then we're going to get a summary of the Galilean ministry. And because of what goes on with the Galilean ministry, we're going to see what ends up happening, and what Jesus ends up doing and why he ends up doing it. So with no further ado, let's get into something more positive than the headlines these days. There are 2 more miracles that are going to prove Jesus' authority. The first of these last 2 miracles is Matthew 27 through 31. And then we're going to see a summary. When Jesus departed from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out, saying, "Son of David, have mercy on us." And when he had come into their house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" And they said to him, "Yes, Lord." And he touched their eyes, saying, "According to your faith, let it be to you." And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, saying, "See that no one knows it." And when they had departed, they spread the news about him in all the countryside. So, that is the first of those 2 miracles that Matthew puts together. Remember, we said there was a series of miracles, and they were kind of set up a certain way in a section of, well, we'll move on. But we had all talked about this before. Roughly 6 set up in 2s. So let's start talking about this. Jesus is going to go ahead and demonstrate again, doing king stuff. He's still in the same region of the Galilee. Matthew clumps Jesus' ministry in terms of region. And so he ends up departing from there. Where's there? There is the last place he was. So he went out into all of that, of rumor went, but he's dealt with the girl. He's risen her from the dead. He went out from there, that area. Two blind men followed him. I noticed their plea, Son of David, have mercy on us. Now, they're immediately using a messianic title. And that is terribly important because it indicates that these two blind men believed that Messiah had the power to be able to heal their blindness. So they believed that Messiah could actually do things like that. These miracles are clearly messianic. And so Jesus ends up doing more of the stuff associated with Messiah. By the way, Rabbi Singer never spends any time repudiating the miracles that Jesus did, which are associated with the authentication of his office. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. Someone came on, but I think there's a word missing in the sentence. So I will deal with that, but there seems to be a conjunction or a connector missing. So I'm going to keep moving along. Now, if I don't get to something because I'm not reacting to the feed, I'm teaching right now. So I have to sort of divide the tasks up. That's where the Q&A afterwards is really useful and good. Because we are dealing with exegesis here. We're not even just dealing with apologetics, even though apologetics has the foundation of good Bible study, but we're actually dealing with a text. So there is a flow here. And so if I don't deal with things right away, it's because I want to keep the flow of the text. I want to keep this narrative. We're looking at a story here. We're not only looking at God's big story, but we're looking at Matthew telling the story of Jesus's life and teachings. And so there's this sense of story. And so it's infinitely more important than, say, Jane Austen. But let's say, for the sake of argument, I was reading Pride and Prejudice, and I was trying to answer all of the questions that my young daughter or my teen daughter had about Pride and Prejudice. It would be very hard for me to keep the flow of the story, and it would be very disjointed to her. So I'm going to hold things in reserve. I do like to go back to them, so I'm not ignoring anybody. And I see at least one. I see one of the moderators, and so I'm really kind of excited about that. And so we're dealing with these messianic title. As I said, one thing that Singer never does is repudiate the miracles. And the miracles really were authentications back then. And so I think the idea is that if I could disprove it from the Bible, then obviously, and it does make a certain amount of sense, the miracles would then be false miracles. But the point is the miracles themselves are part of the Bible, because these miracles are named as what Jesus will do. Free the captives, give sight to the blind. So they are scriptural, if you see what I'm getting at. Okay, still paying attention, but I'm going to kind of keep going. So messianic titles used. And that means they believed Messiah was capable of this, which shows kind of a level of faith already. Now, Jesus is going to go ahead and kind of press the issue a little bit here. Okay? Notice the setting, though. When he'd come into the house, the blind men came to him. And then Jesus asked the question. So the setting is given to us. Part of the flavor of the story here. And Jesus then asks them, because they've cried out to him as if they believe he can do this. But Jesus says, do you believe that I am able to do this? The Greek word is actually the word we get dynamite from. And they said, yes, Lord. The Lord, someone's going to want to say it's just sir. The word for Lord is used both to translate the four consonant name of God, as well as in a more general sense. I'm not sure it's general here. I would be absolutely sure it wasn't general if these men were, and the Greek word being used would be proskuneo, which would mean to worship. We don't have that in the immediate context, so the possibility exists that this is a more respectful term. Now, some versions translate the word Lord as Sir. Now, I don't like that because there are places where Jesus is clearly being acknowledged as deity. This doesn't force us to believe that deity is in mind, but it certainly hints that it's possible. So I'm going to let this be an ambiguous text in the sense of it isn't totally clear, but it is somewhat likely. If proskuneo was there, I would say you have a really strong case that Sir is not the idea here. They answer yes. Now that's important. Do you believe that Messiah is able to do this is different than saying, do you believe that I'm able to do this? By the way, if they call out to him, Son of David, and that's a messianic title, and then Jesus says, do you believe that I'm able to do this? He's making messianic claims here. And I want you to see that. Nobody had any question about the messianic claims. And that's really important to understand. This idea that Jesus didn't make any claims is a totally erroneous idea. Simply by responding and asking them if they believe he can do it, after he said, Son of David, have mercy on us, means that Jesus is accepting their messianic title and he's making a claim to be the Christ. And so that's kind of the setting, and they're acknowledging that they really are willing to trust. The interesting thing about this is they aren't merely intellectually trusting, they're really banking on the fact that he's able to do this. This isn't an intellectual question for them. And that's why I talked about dunamis. The real issue for Jesus is faith in him, not their eyesight, not just doing a miracle to do a show, but the real issue is faith in him. And that's why dunamis, do you have the power to do this? Are you able to do this? Do you believe I'm able to do this? This could be a middle or passive. Middle would be, do you believe I myself can do this? Or the idea that I can do this for you. The middle and passive sometimes have the same sort of form. It's present active, and it's according to your faith, Jesus' response. Faith in what? Faith in Jesus. Remember the response? Jesus ends up opening their eyes, but the issue is faith in Jesus in particular, not just faith in God, and not just faith that they can be healed. Now, I bring this up because what is the faith in? What is the object of the faith? There are plenty of people that believe things and have faith, but what is the object of their faith? Which needs to be questioned. The Greek there is according to the faith of you. That's literally the way it reads. Kata tain piston humon. Okay? And so the real faith, the real issue is faith in Jesus. Not faith in faith, not faith that God can heal, but actual faith in Jesus as the Messiah and the one that's able to go ahead and do messianic stuff that has that kingdom authority. Now it gets interesting here because Jesus is going to ask them to do something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Their eyes were opened in verse 30, and he warned them, saying, "See that no one knows it." Well, now wait a minute here. This is contrary to what you would expect, wouldn't it? I mean, if you want word to get out about your ministry, you don't tell people not to talk about you. Why not broadcast it? Let's go ahead and you tell everybody what I've done for you. Because after all, he's operating within the office of Messiah and doing king stuff. Why would he say that? There's a term used in scholarly circles called the Messianic Secret. Now, it appears more in terms of scholarship with Mark, but Jesus is going to tell people not to say anything. And so this term is sort of developed, and you're going to see this in Matthew. Why would Jesus do this? It's not the right time. He's authenticating his office, but it isn't the right time as far as the people are not ready to receive him for the right reasons. See, a lot of people want God's candy, but they don't want God. Now, what do I mean by God's candy? They want prosperity, they want peace, they want health, but what they don't want is they don't want the giver. In fact, this is what amazes me. No one, our whole nation wasn't busy as a nation, sincerely and totally sold out on thanking God for health. But I bet after 9/11, there were people filling the churches. We want this stuff. We want heaven without God. This is very normative. As I talk to some of the crazier ideas out there, some in my own family, they want all the benefits of utopia without the God that comes with it. People want heaven without God, and God can't give that because there's no such thing. And so that's where part of the thing is. And the people may want the goodies, and Jesus is even going to whittle the crowd down. You're going to see him do this, and you're going to be saying, why would he do this? Because he wants not fans, but followers. And so he's going to go ahead and do this, and this is just not the right time. People are going to hear about this anyway, but people would come to him not necessarily for the right reasons. We're going to see that these guys can't even follow simple directions. Okay? In fact, let's talk about this a little more. There are several reasons given for the secret. One, you're going to see what happens when he gets too crowded. He can't move around freely. So one reason given for the Messianic Secret is not only that the people weren't ready, but there also needs to be a certain amount of freedom for him to move around. Jesus didn't want people forced to accept him at Messiah. And then there's the agenda. And by the way, what's interesting is, if Jesus is the king and they got all the goodies, they would probably want to enthrone him to keep getting the goodies and get more of the goodies. But the point very clearly is that Messianic suffering is going to precede Messianic glory. By the way, this is something else that really throws Jewish people, because they're expecting the kingly glory without the suffering servant. This is something that Singer doesn't get. One of the great scandals, we can call it the divine scandal, is that suffering precedes glory. Before honor, there is humility, according to Proverbs. That is the pattern. Don't be surprised in our lives if there's a little bit of humbling or hard circumstances before glory comes, because before honor is humility. And this pattern isn't just for us. Jesus actually exhibited this pattern. And so his disciples need time, because he's going to tell them about the Messianic suffering. And they really aren't going to be ready for it. And the adjustment is going to need to be there. And so there are a lot of reasons for this secret. But the bottom line is Jesus wasn't interested in fly-by-night fans. And I'm concerned that, and we're all guilty to a certain extent, but I'm concerned that we might not be promoting fandom as opposed to followers. And so that's something to be concerned about. What did the blind men do? This is hysterical. They've been told by the one who just gave them their sight back, right? That really only one thing's been laid upon them. Jesus didn't say, go sell all your possessions. Jesus didn't say, he said, don't tell anybody. What did they immediately do? Well, the text tells us they immediately did what they were told not to do. They immediately went and spread the news throughout the countryside. It wasn't a hard request, or was it? They were blind. Maybe people were asking what happened. But they are quite willing to spread the news. Now, the next miracle you would think is merely a physical miracle, but you're going to get some background tonight that will put some new light on this. As they went out, behold, they brought to him a man mute. So they actually spread the news, and then it looks like they're bringing someone else to Jesus. And you're thinking, mute, okay, no big deal. He's handled the blind, he's handled the mute, but this is really about the spiritual realm. Well, why? Because he was mute and demon possessed. And the idea of the text here is he was mute because he was demon possessed. In other words, his inability to speak was not merely physical, but there was a spiritual component to this. Because when the demon was cast out, verse 32 through 34, we see a change. Okay? And so the mute man then is able to speak, which gives us the idea that Jesus' authority over the spiritual realm cast out the demon that was manifesting itself in its control over this individual by preventing him from speaking. And the crowds marvel. They say it has never been seen like this in Israel. And of course, the Pharisees have their countercharge, and we'll talk about that. He cast out demons by the ruler of demons. Why had they never seen a mute individual healed before? There were prophets around. Why is this so spectacular? Why do the crowds get so excited about this? Because of a common belief at the time. The common belief among the Jews at the time was to cast out a demon, you had to cast it out by name. So you had to ascertain the name of the demon. Because to cast it out, you had to cast that specific demon out or demons out. And so you named them and then commanded them by some authority or means to leave. But this man's mute. So how is Jesus going to know which demon is in this man? Now, this is the thinking at the time. Let's show you how this works in Mark 5, 7 through 10. And he cried out with a loud voice, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High?" We actually covered this same section in Matthew. "Are you here to torment me?" For he said to them, "Come out of him, unclean spirit." And then he asked, now watch, he asks the man, "What is your name?" He's not asking what the name of the demon-possessed man is. He's asking what the name of the demon is, which would have been expected practice in that time. My name is Legion, for we are many, which means there's more than one demon there. And so there's a legion of demons and this poor guy. And he also begged earnestly that he would not send him out of the country. Okay, so Mark's telling the same story, but notice that Jesus asks the name of the demon because that's what Jews believed. Now, the miracle and wonderment for the people is Jesus is able to cast this demon out without knowing its name. Because this guy's mute and he can't tell him. And so the people are marveled. And this is what they mean this has never been done in Israel, because never has a exorcism occurred in which the demon's name was not ascertained or did not end up being revealed. From the memory of the people, that just didn't make sense to them. And so that's why this is so incredible. Jesus cast out demons by sheer authority without necessarily having to even know their names. He has that much control over the spiritual realm. And so Jesus is further emphasizing his authority over the spiritual realm by doing so without having to follow the normal procedure and just by his authority to do so. And so this is an incredible sign, but it isn't really just about the man being mute. It's basically about Jesus' spiritual authority yet again. And this is what's going to really, really bother the Pharisees. Okay? The Pharisees need an explanation for this. How does this man have the authority to cast out demons, much less being able to cast them out with authority without knowing their names? We have to come up with a reason for this because the people are seeing this. And they're going to come to believe in this guy. It's kind of interesting. Modern day Pharisees that don't like Jesus pull some of the same sorts of weird tricks as we're seeing. And so, and I'm being a little funny, but remember that rabbinical Judaism comes out of the Pharisaic Judaism of the Second Temple period, because really the Essenes didn't have any children and they got wiped out, and the Sadducees controlled the temple, and when the temple was gone, they lost all their power. And really, when you're left with the Second Temple period, you really have the formation of rabbinical Judaism out of Pharisaic Judaism and the believers and followers of Messiah. And that's who's left standing. What's their explanation for this? Oh, it's easy. Jesus is using Satan's authority to cast out Satan's workers. Now, Jesus will later respond to this because this is going to be a repeated charge. But this is their grasping at straws attempt to explain this, because this is a big stuff. And basically you have intense stuff going on here. And the Pharisees really need a way to explain all of this. And so their explanation is it's not that Jesus really has authority that's divine authority. No, his authority has to come from the other place. Notice what the Pharisees don't do. They don't deny that a demon was cast out, and they don't deny that this was supernatural. The Sadducees are a little bit more naturalists, not believing in the resurrection or angels. The Pharisees had a firm belief in the supernatural. Remember that Jesus' problem with the Pharisees was less about their theology and more about their practice. The Pharisees' theology was pretty orthodox, but their practice stank. But they were more biblically accurate. So their theology was more correct, but their practice of that theology and their additional laws had obscured God's word and led to all sorts of problems. They had put a wrong emphasis, added things, but the underlying theology was far better than the Sadducees. There's some question about the Essenes. They had some real problems with being ascetics. And that's kind of comes up a little later. So the Pharisees have no problem. They don't say it's a psychological problem at all. They say it's a spiritual problem, but the answer is he isn't getting his authority from God. Don't be mistaken about that. Jesus is not going to deal with that. You might say, why? He'll confront it later. Now, what do we see happen through all of this? Well, Jesus continues to go through their villages and cities, teaching in their synagogues. And I want you to notice the activities here. Look at the ing words. This is a little cute trick here. Look at the ing words. Those are participles. This is where I learned how valuable English class was. English class didn't become valuable to me until I took Greek and Hebrew and went into seminary. And until I started really, until I started teaching the Bible, till my ministry of teaching kind of began. Because pay attention to those ing words. First of all, they usually indicate continuing action in some manner. The other thing is they give the main activities. So what are Jesus's main activities? Well, he's teaching in their synagogues. Okay. And there's a particular Greek word. By the way, teaching and preaching are different. Caruso is different than the word for teaching. And he was healing among the people. So the activities included teaching, preaching, and healing. Now, again, God does heal, but I'm pretty sure that preaching and teaching are two activities that continue. So he was expounding the Word of God, and he was teaching that Word of God in terms of how it should impact our lives and hearts. I'm not going to be rigid in my categories, because some people are preacher teachers and some people are teacher preachers, and then some people are just more teachers and some people are just more preachers. And I don't know where the lines are, but I know the activities aren't exactly the same because they're listed separately. So he continues. Now, this is really a summary statement about his Galilean ministry. Okay? He saw the multitudes and he was moved with compassion. Is going to be the next verse. Okay? He saw the multitudes. He was moved with compassion. That should come up in just a second. Jesus is going to see the need. He's doing the work, but he's going to continue to see the extreme need. How do I know what I'm supposed to do in ministry? Because you're going to see a need that's particularly going to bother you. That's one of the things I shared this morning. It's not the only thing, but is there something that you really think needs to be done and it's not being done? Well, that can be a clue. He saw the multitudes. He was moved with compassion for them. Why is he moved with compassion for them? Well, that's what the because is there because of. They're weary and scattered like sheep with no shepherd. Now, that's a very interesting term, shepherd, because the term shepherd, in terms of leaders and spiritual leaders, is not just in the New Testament. Most people think that the term pastor or shepherd only occurs in the New Testament. It actually goes back to the Old Testament, where Ezekiel talks about the spiritual leaders of Israel being false shepherds who feed only themselves and feed on the sheep instead of taking care of the sheep. And in that analogy in Ezekiel, the sheep are the children of Israel. And so this language harkens back to the prophets who basically tell the leaders that they're not fulfilling their function before God. They're using their authority in ways that they ought not use it. So what I want you to know is that the term shepherd or pastor actually has its roots in the Old Testament or Tanakh or Hebrew scriptures. Sometimes I'll be in Messianic congregations and they avoid the term shepherd or pastor. And yet it's a terribly Jewish term. I don't know why they do that. Where do you think the church got it from? David was a shepherd of livestock, and then God made him a shepherd of Israel. They are scattered. They're like sheep, but they have no leadership. Why don't they have leadership? Aren't there Pharisees around? The leaders are not getting their hands dirty. The leaders are not leading. Humbly, I want to suggest that a leader who will not get his hands dirty doing the work is somebody you need to watch out for a little bit. A leader needs to be willing to do what he's asking others to do. In other words, if a pastor won't go out and do outreach, then he can't expect his congregation to do outreach. One of the best ways to get a evangelically excited church is to have a pastor who's willing to do the work of the evangelist. Now, Timothy's told to do that work, but he's not told he is an evangelist. And he's not told to focus just on that work or to make that a priority, but he's told to be willing to do the work of the evangelist. A lot of times what happens is leaders start out being practitioners and then they become simply bosses. That is a very, very bad situation. That is not good. And so that's something that can happen. The leader gets larger and he gets separated from the very things that he needs not necessarily to totally isolate himself from. One of the reasons that I believe as an apologist, I also need to be involved with street work or reaching people or pushing myself out there is because it cannot become simply ivory tower. I need to do the work, to study, to be better at giving the information. And I think it's too easy to go ahead and do that. Now let's look at what's going to happen here. The ministry is becoming truly large. Well, Jesus is God. He can handle it, right? But he's also enfleshed, and he laid aside his independent attributes of greatness. Let me state the kenosis correctly and doctrinally correct. When Jesus enfleshed himself, he gave up the independent use of his attributes of greatness. What do I mean by that? The omnis. Okay? It doesn't mean he wasn't. He didn't exercise them apart from the Father. He accepted human restrictions to a certain extent to be truly human. In taking a human nature in addition to his divine nature, he limited himself. The Greek is actually the word emptied himself. It's used in Philippians 2, 5 through 11. Okay? He emptied himself. Believe me, I was tested on this in my ordination. You better have the right answers, because otherwise you end up in heresy. He didn't cease to be divine. He didn't cease to be human. So how did he empty himself? He gave up the independent use of his attributes of greatness, not goodness. So in being in a human body, he was not omnipresent all the time. He was localized. He was in one place. Could he be able to see? Yeah, he says to Nathan, I saw you under the tree when you went out to pray. But the independent use of is the issue there. So here's the thing. He's a human being. He has limited himself. Is he God? Yes. But he doesn't independently use all of his divinity. He accepts some human limitations, which means that he's going to get tired. He slept. Isn't that interesting? God Almighty, he that keepeth Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps, but when Messiah took human form, he acquiesced to accept from the Father the gift we enjoy called sleep, which really is a gift from God. And he limited himself, taking on the form of a bondservant. So now the ministry is really starting to grow. Jesus, as God, could have done it all instantaneously, but in limiting himself, he is going to use other people. Now, God can do everything without us, but he chooses to use us. And Jesus, having come in the flesh, is going to follow the same pattern, by the way, that the Father's willing to follow in using human beings in his plan. What a tremendous thing that is, that we can be a part of God's plans, that we were designed to be a part of God's plan. That's truly exciting. So he calls and he says to his disciples, Matthew 9:37 and 38, he said to his disciples, the harvest is truly plentiful, but the laborers are few. And then he says, run out and do my work. No, he doesn't say that. He says, therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Is he going to train them and send them? Yes, he is. That's 10:1. But he asks them to pray. So I entitled this, Pray Until You Become the Answer. Because all so often what God does is he asks us to pray about things because in burdening us with them, we will be drawn to partner with him in completing them. And so prayer is simply a way of engaging, sometimes, our wills, minds, and hearts towards the task that he has for us anyway. And you see, that's the key. He tells the disciples to pray for it, and then he uses the disciples who were praying to do it. When he called the 12 disciples to him, he gave them power. Now notice this. They're going to be able to do king stuff. They're going to be able to do the same stuff because he's using them as legates. Shalachim is the Hebrew. Shalach is to send, the sent ones. But the cool thing is that the sent one of a rabbi carried the authority of that rabbi with him as he traveled. If I sent a disciple out with my message or to complete a function, that disciple carried my authority to do that. Now, in the Roman world, they had a similar thing. They were called legates. Now, if you've ever watched the movie The Robe, and I know it's not perfectly biblical, but it really is a good movie, and the end scene where he's literally witnessing to Nero and testifying to his faith and defending that faith is really pretty cool. And in that movie, there's a thing where, I'm thinking if it's The Robe or it's Masada. I might have my late night movies confused. But there's a point in which someone says, this is the imperial, this is the emperor's legate over you and over me. And then he takes the authority. And the idea was that if you were a legate of the emperor and you carried the edict of the emperor, you carried the authority of the emperor with you. So when he sends these disciples, these shalachim, these talmidim out, they carry with him the authority to continue and multiply his work, which gives them authority over unclean spirits and to heal all kinds of diseases. Why? Because in demonstrating Jesus' authority, they were authenticating Jesus' office. Who sent you? By what authority do you do these things? The authority indicated the level of, I'm trying to think of an equivalent, because we don't function in that sort of society as much. But if I'm doing the things, and I'm doing them because I carry the other person's authority, I'm authenticating the other person. In whose name do you speak? Is the same as saying, by what authority? Now, that's terribly important, and I'm going to take a second or two, even though it's not on the slide, because in dealing with Muslim ministry, you want to pray in the name of Jesus. Why? Because when that prayer is answered, it demonstrates Jesus' authority, which is an authority that Muhammad does not have. And that's terribly important, I think, even for Jewish people. They need to hear that in Jesus' name. I know that might be offensive. And you could use Jewish lingo. Okay? Yeshua HaMashiach. But why is it important? Because I'm not asking God based on my own merit. I'm asking God based on my connection and union with Jesus and his authority as the divine Messianic King. So I want to encourage you, in Jesus' name is not just a formula. When you say those words, realize whose authority and whose office and whose person you're invoking. Okay? Because it's terribly important that we understand the gravity of that, the import of that. And by the way, you see the same thing during the Talmudic period. There were set prayers that rabbis had wrote. When you read the Talmud, so-and-so will teach in the name of Rabbi Yohani. So-and-so, when I'm reading Talmud, it will say that Rabbi so-and-so said in the name of Rabbi so-and-so. And he's invoking that rabbi's authority for his teaching. And so Jesus gives them his authority to do these things as a demonstration and to multiply the work. Rather than telling people and just telling them, Jesus is creating workers, apprentices under him that will carry on the work, and he's going to be training them. And by the way, this is on-the-job training. God often trains on the job. I can't do this, I don't know how, but you will. People ask me if I'm ready to preach. I say I will be. Why do I say I will be? Because I will be. I've got a divine appointment, and so I will be ready to preach. Do I necessarily feel ready at that moment? Well, that's a different question. But when I stand up there, I know that I'm standing up there for someone else. If you're preaching the gospel, do I have the authority to preach the gospel? Yes, you do. Why? Because Jesus said I have the authority to preach the gospel. All authority is given to me in heaven and earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations. Do I have the authority to preach the gospel? Yes, I have the authority to preach the gospel. You have the authority to preach the gospel. You don't have an authority problem here. Not as far as the authority to share that message. Do I need to be as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove? Yes, I do. But I also need to be bold in the authority I've been given to share the message of Jesus. And it can be a little frightening on the streets. But this is the authority that you have. And so I'm just kind of encouraging you with the proper grounds for boldness. And so he's sending them out in his authority, and then you have authority to share also. I'm not going out looking for demon-possessed people. But I know that Jesus will authenticate his message through my preaching or sharing or teaching the word. So let's get to a summary. How do I know if it's working? How do I know if it's working? Because everything's met? Because I'm in the place where I want to be as a faith missionary financially? Maybe. For some missionaries, that's very true. Can I be sure of that? Well, that's not the point. what I thought about a few times, what kept a Hudson Taylor going? Because Jesus is worth it and his message is worth it. So if you're ever asking whether it's worth it, that's sort of what you have to go back to. What fueled your passion? What was a passion for Jesus and his message? At least that should have been there, and I'm hoping that if it's lagged a little, and that happens, hard things come against us, that you will retake that up. Work, trust, and pray, then stand back and let God do the rest. God did it with the disciples, and he will. Jesus did what the Father told him. He trusted the Father, and he let God do the rest. And the rest is up to God. At the end of the day, it's God who ends up determining the results. And the results that he wants, even though if they're not necessarily to the extent that we might want. So that takes us to the calling of the disciples and the continuing ministry of Jesus, as the summary statement that Matthew wants in place is there for the Galilean ministry. The way I understand Matthew is that Matthew very deliberately ends up setting it up in terms of Galilee, Judah, and Jerusalem. Now, Matthew has not set things up chronologically. I'll let you know that. Matthew has grouped stuff together. Luke said he set upon himself, or he set to give an orderly account, Luke chapter 1, we talked about it yesterday, to Theophilus of the things which he has seen, which those who were with Jesus from that has been seen and been heard. And so Luke is more chronological than Matthew is. Matthew is interested in giving an orderly account. Luke is interested in giving an orderly account. Matthew is interested in giving a Messianic Davidic account. And so their goals are different. They don't contradict, they complement. It's stereophonic vision, quadraphonic vision, instead of quadraphonic sound that the Gospels are producing. You work, you trust, and you pray. God can handle the rest. And in that light, I'm praying and trusting and working towards the trip I need to take. And it would be great to see God really gain a victory over the things that can come against. If he has other plans, he will let us know. But it would be exciting to watch. Again, more information about the radio show I was on, but there is a website there, and I'll give you exact links to the exact show. I'm so glad that you guys were with me tonight. Not as apologetic. I should say that not as much apologetics, more exegesis. But we are enjoying taking a trip with Matthew to see Jesus through Jewish eyes, to see Matthew through Jewish eyes, and take a look at what's going on here. Now, a few comments were made. I'm going to expand this so my little eyeballs can see it. Dealing with the synoptics and dealing with John is probably one of the hardest things. Yes, Luke's acts is a continuing story. They're to wait for the gift of the Spirit, which appears is given to them right on Shavuot, which is Pentecost, which I could do a whole message on. And by the way, I've been remiss in doing nothing on Purim. So next week I may plan some special things as I prepare for my trip. But yes, they're to wait until Pentecost, which in Jewish thinking has been the anniversary of the giving of the law. And so you have the law and the Spirit, because that's when the Spirit's given. And that goes back to the law being a pedagogos, which we've talked about before. And now the Spirit lives in us and makes the word clear to us and in its application for our personal lives. So I definitely agree that Luke and Acts are sequels, and you need to put them together. And someone else was pointing out John, but that's not really a question. In the Gospel of Matthew, which is not necessarily chronological, Jesus's ministry in Galilee appears to come before his ministry in Jerusalem, but that's not a chronological statement. That's a statement of Matthew kind of showing how Jesus gathers his workers, where he ends up coming from and moving out from there. So Matthew's got purposes in that. But really, the summary statement in Galilee is related to the events that came before it. The typical understanding of this is that Matthew has divided it up this way, just as Luke divides it up in terms of you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and to the uttermost parts of the world. That's the outline for Acts. How the gospel spreads from Jerusalem to Rome, the spiritual center of the world, to the political center of the world. And so that's the way I see Matthew breaking it up. We don't see Jesus coming into that public ministry until after his baptism, and then John. And then John fades from the scene as Jesus' ministry increases. Again, Matthew isn't trying to be chronological necessarily. So it's not a comment on the chronology of the events. It's a comment on how Matthew raises the material. And John has an entirely different message. And we discussed that last night, how the Gospels kind of fit together. So I think that was most of what I saw. I'm really grateful everyone was here. And I want to thank the folks who are moderators, because they have done an excellent job of being here to moderate. Don't feel bored if you don't have a fist fight to go ahead and break up. I still love having you here, and it's really great to have moderators. And it's very important to have moderators. It's just, this wasn't really so shocking to, in a sense, maybe not such a shocking topic, but certainly a worthwhile topic. So, I am thrilled everyone's here. I'm also thrilled with the number of people that tune in after. We had some special visitors, and then I know that some people come in after. I'm going to probably get something to drink and settle in back here. And kind of get ready. There's a lot going on with the Muslim conference here. And then I probably will be shouldering more of that responsibility, and then preparing for a big trip. Again, I really want to see the grandchild, so and do the speaking. So I thank all of you who thank me. I really appreciate the encouragement, and I'm going to work, trust, and pray the best I can. May God help thou my little bouts of unbelief. And I hope you will do likewise too. I will be able to see you. I will try to do some, maybe get vocal and stuff on the road. I don't know what internet will be like, and I will be pressed for time, but I will try to keep things going as best I can. So. I'm going to keep typing, but